So, imagine if season 1 of Glee and American Horror Story had a tone deaf child. That child would be Scream Queens. When Scream Queens originally aired, I got into the show blindly. I mean, I knew it was going to be some horror type of show, but I really didn't know anything else. So when I watched the pilot, I thought it was some of the weirdest, cringy TV that I had seen in a while. But it also gave me a vibe from another TV show called Glee. So I quickly understood that this was going to be like that times 100. By episode 3, I was completely drawn in and I realized that this was maybe going to be one of my favorite shows from the decade. Or so I thought. So season 1 ends, we find out who the killer is, and I was like, yeah, cool, I could definitely do another season of this. Season 2 rolls around, and with every episode I start to lose more and more interest, and finally, on episode 5, I give up. At that point, I realized that I didn't even know why I was still watching the show, or what I even liked about it in the first place. So recently, I think about it again, and I wonder if I was maybe too harsh with it, and I finally finished the show. So yeah, I was a little too harsh with the show, but it was still far from perfect. I went back, looked at season 1, and I did a little thinking, so let's talk about Scream Queens.
Good morning, Slits.
Good morning, Chanel.
Scream Queens premiered in 2015, and at this time, creators Ryan Murphy, Ian Brennan, and Brad Falchuk had their hands full. The trio were quote-unquote obsessed with 80s and early 90s slasher films. So, for those who don't know, a slasher film is a subgenre of horror films involving a killer murdering a group of people, usually by use of bladed tools. The general formula revolves around trauma caused by wrongful events, and said trauma will generally be triggered by a commemoration or an anniversary, and thus would lead to a killing spree. So, when done the right way, the story could be very interesting. When Ryan pitched the idea to Fox, they immediately greenlit the show and ordered 15 episodes, and that was a big deal because they trusted his idea so much that they didn't even ask to see a pilot. Fox started promoting the show months before a single scene of the show was even filmed. I mean, seriously, they promoted the crap out of the show. They were everywhere. When doing the casting for the show, Ryan already had most of the cast he wanted in mind and reached out to them. He reached out to Ariana Grande, Nick Jonas, Jamie Lee Curtis, and even revealed that if Jamie had said no, there wouldn't have even been a show. Jamie Lee Curtis is known for many things, most notably for being a scream queen, which is Hollywood's cute way of saying a professional damsel in distress. The rest of the cast included Lea Michele, Keke Palmer, Billie Lourd, Abigail Breslin, Skylar Samuels, and of course, Emma Roberts, whose American Horror Story character actually sort of inspired the show. Overall, the ensemble cast was a strong one. The first season focuses on the Kappa Kappa Tau sorority at the Wallace University, led by Chanel Oberlin and her fellow Chanels. The sorority is severely disliked by the school's dean, Kathy Mudge. Circumstances reignite a 20-year-old murder mystery with the reemergence of the serial killer dressed as the Red Devil mascot who begins targeting the sorority members. This story was a breath of fresh air. Colleges and sororities are one of the least featured sectors in Hollywood. Now, I'm not saying that they're never done, but for every, say, dozen high school films or series, you get maybe one story centered around college kids. So the choice of location was already standing out. The show itself was basically a parody and an homage to the horror genre, hence the name Scream Queens. When watching the show, you could find details that were borrowed from numerous cult classics. The characters of the Chanels, for example, were inspired by the Heathers, which isn't exactly a traditional slasher film, but instead borrows many aspects from it. Jamie Lee Curtis recreated the iconic shower scene from Psycho, which, fun fact, the original scene was done by her mother. I mean, the list goes on. There were nods and references to Sleepaway Camp 3, Boogeyman, Carrie, Halloween, Friday the 13th, A Nightmare on Elm Street. Like, if you're into these types of movies, you would have a blast picking up on references.
Seems like you are the students most likely to be killed by the alleged psychopath.
We gotta make a real plan to keep you guys safe going forward.
In season 1, Ryan promised that every episode would at least have one death, and by the end of the season, only 4 characters would make it out alive. So, when watching the first season, you had 2 questions in mind: who done it and who's next? By the end of season 1, there were actually more than 4 who survived, and there were also multiple killers. It wasn't the conclusion most expected, but it was still somewhat satisfying enough that no one made too much of a fuss about it. Ryan revealed that this would sort of be an anthology series in the sense that the location would change every season, but the characters would remain the same. The location of the second season was a hospital that the former college dean purchased in order to find a cure for a deadly disease that she contracted. After being shunned by their families, the Chanels are hired by the dean as nurses. Zayday comes back as a med student, and we get new characters who work for the hospital. Of course, the season also sees a new killer called the Green Meanie. The season was only 10 episodes long, and as of right now would be the last one before its cancellation. Scream Queens was not groundbreaking by any means, but it was good and it was different, and it stood out from almost everything that was airing on TV at the time. So it was kind of a bummer when things started to go downhill only after one season. Fox is a major television company, so for a show not being able to garner at least 10 million viewers will get your show cancelled. I mean, like I said earlier, Scream Queens was advertised like crazy, so the fact that it only managed to get an average of 3 million viewers in its first season was bad. The second season had a lot less advertisement and only had an average of 1 million viewers, so it's pretty obvious why Fox canceled the show, but it doesn't answer how the show itself got so bad. So let's talk about that.
Guess it's just a matter of time before one of us, or all of us, ends up dead.
When watching season 1, we knew that 4 characters out of the main cast would survive, but we didn't know who yet, and the fun/scary part of the episodes was wondering who would die and who would be left. That also gave us a process of elimination tactic to figure out who the killer might be. So, by the season finale, there were way more than 4 characters left, and then and there, we already knew that the stakes weren't as high as we thought they'd be. Ryan said himself that it was really hard for him to hire people only to kill them off in a few episodes, so it's clear that killing off the main characters was hard for him to do. In season 2, it was pretty obvious when we'd see the main characters struggling for their life that they would in fact be fine. So the question was no longer whether they were gonna die, but more how they were gonna escape the situation. Because this was an anthology series, the show would switch themes every season, but instead of completely changing the story, Ryan decided to keep the same characters but instead put them in different locations, and boy, was that a bad idea. Bringing back the same characters completely destroyed the premise of the show, which is about figuring out who the killer was. Like, we already know that the returning characters aren't the killers, so now our suspect pool is cut in half. By bringing back the same characters who adapted to a specific environment, everything felt off, and Ryan was setting himself up for failure, because how many times was he going to be able to move these characters around? I mean, the Chanels as nurses, really? So basically, with season 2, the writers failed to give a proper continuation to the story, because really, what continuation was even needed? The idea of horror in hospitals, though completely overused, can still be very interesting when done the right way, but it didn't work with the characters from the first season. The plot and the comedy in season 2 became so predictable and ridiculous that it was just uncomfortable. Everything was a mismatch. Not only that, but the killers turned out to be multiple killers again, so the writers pretty much used the same easy way out as the previous season. I mean, you can tell when writers get bored with an idea and don't put much effort into it anymore. Not only that, but when you have a writer/writers who are working on multiple shows, one of the shows will sometimes suffer from it. Just look at season 6 of Vampire Diaries compared to season 2 of the originals, or season 6 of Buffy the Vampire Slayer compared to season 3 of Angel. To make matters worse, Ryan is literally known for being terrible at continuations. Don't get me wrong, the guy's a genius, he comes up with great stuff, but he never seems to be able to extend those ideas for too long without everything becoming a mess. Just look at Glee. American Horror Story is definitely the style of writing that works for him, because he could switch themes every season. If Scream Queens fully changed themes every season, not only would he have been able to really play with endless themes, he'd actually be able to do some crazy killing offs, because the same actors would be able to come back for the next season and the stakes would be higher. I mean, listen, season 2 of Scream Queens for a lot of people, including myself, was a step down compared to the first season, and it didn't seem like the story could extend itself anymore without becoming unbearably ridiculous. But the thing is, there were just certain episodes in the second season that were so good that it made up for the bad ones. The moments where you understood that the writers were making fun of overused tropes were the best, because if you paid attention, they were done really, really well. Also, can I just say that in a world where Riverdale still has a strong fan base and an upcoming 6th season, a show as brilliant as Scream Queens should not have been cancelled so quickly. Similar to movies like Jennifer's Body that was completely destroyed by critics and viewers, the movie eventually found its audience and has now developed a cult following. Scream Queens is slowly growing its audience again and surprisingly might be coming back for a 3rd season, which Ryan confirmed in May of 2020, so we'll just have to see what happens. At its worst, Scream Queens was an unfunny, boring, over-the-top comedy that fell into the very tropes that it was mocking. But at its best, it was a purely satirical show, a parody and an homage to slasher films while also being a social commentary on today's youth. It was a clever, campy show that was filling in a very empty niche at the time and came ahead of its time because a lot of people didn't seem to understand the point of the show, so it never even got the chance to grow a strong audience. But one thing is for sure, Scream Queens had a lot of potential to become something big, but unfortunately never got the chance to truly take off. Alright, that is all that I have for you today. If you made it this far, thank you. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a big thumbs up. Also, don't hesitate to share your thoughts down below. Thank you again for watching this video, and I'll see you next time.